Hello and welcome to Sansad TV. You're watching Viewpoint with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Well, after 40 days of escalating trade tensions driven by US President Donald Trump's sweeping campaign of reciprocal tariffs, the world's two largest economies agreed to a temporary ceasefire in Geneva on May the 12th. The United States and China jointly announced a 90-day suspension of most of the punitive tariffs they had imposed on each other. Meanwhile, the past 1 month has seen a slew of trade deals being worked out between several nations trying to safeguard their interests. In this edition of Viewpoint, we will analyze how the fragile trade truce will impact the global economy, what it means for multilaterals, and if this is the new normal. Joining me on the program today are Rajnish Gupta, Partner, Economic Policy, EY India, Professor Niti Bhasin, Delhi School of Economics, and Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharyya, Career Diplomat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Viewpoint. Ambassador, let me start the program with you first. Let's hear your opening thoughts really on the fragile trade truce that has been worked out between China and the United States. How do you look at this?
I think this is an expected outcome. The kind of very rabid initiatives that had been announced by the Trump administration within the first few days of its assumption of office were rather excessive and perhaps not entirely in line or consonance with multilateral understandings. And therefore, it was necessary for all countries to find ways to deal with it. What became very abundantly clear was that Trump was doing this as an opening gambit in order to start negotiations. And we did see that many countries took up that early bait, including India. As an early beginner, as an early bird, I think we will have certain advantages in that particular aspect. We've seen the UK has already concluded the deal. But I think the big fish was really the trade issues with China, because all this happened because of China, because the way the Chinese had gamed the WTO system and had raked out certain advantages which were in its favor, but also to the disfavor of other countries. And so there was to be a certain escalatory tariff war that had happened because both sides could not lose face. But I'm happy that they met in Geneva and they have found that temporary truce, as you mentioned. And we hope that this will pave the way for an understanding between these two large trading nations, because a lot of it then spills over to the rest of the world.
You know, talking about the temporary truce, I'll come back to you in the next round, Ambassador, about whether this truce is going to hold or not and what's it going to take really to build on this. But before that, let me get in the other panelists as well. Niti Bhasin, let me come to you now. You know, what does this really mean as far as the global economy is concerned? What does it mean for trade as a whole?
All right. So if I look at it purely from an economic point of view, for US and China, the trade truce works well, particularly for the US, because the premise on which the tariffs were levied was not a very sound economic premise. Now, apart from the fact that it is going to work well for these two nations, it is in general going to be good for the global economy as well, because we are not really getting into something like a more aggravated trade war now. I mean, if we go back a little bit in history, we already know that trade wars, or where countries try to levy retaliatory tariffs on each other, doesn't benefit anyone in the long run. And it is going to lead to contraction of international trade. And that's precisely what happened after the Second World War as well. So the only way out of it was to then enter into a GATT agreement where every country decides to lower the tariffs that they have levied on each other. We are in a somewhat similar situation now as well. It is good that the truce has happened so that we do not get into a deeper, bait of countries levying retaliatory tariffs on each other. Trade, therefore, should expand. However, at the same time, if announcements like these keep on happening, where on one date we see huge tariffs announced and then they are taken back the other day, this lends a lot of uncertainty to the global trade environment and a lot of volatility as well. Because when we talk about trade and when we talk about investment, these are decisions, stocking decisions, supply decisions, they don't happen overnight. And so if we continue to get, announcements like these where there are major policy changes happening, then it is going to lead to a lot of volatility for trade in general in times to come. But yes, the truce is good news, especially I think for the US, because the tariffs were not announced on an economic rationale, and they really don't have a competitive alternative to China at the present moment. So levying tariffs simply means that they have made goods expensive for their own citizens. So yes, I think it works well as far as we see for both these countries as well as for the global trade environment.
Okay, it's definitely a move in the right direction. It works for these two countries, and because these two countries are the biggest economies in the world, it has an impact on everyone else around as well, is the thought process coming through. All right, Rajnish, Gupta, let me bring you into the picture now. Where does this really leave major companies around the world? Where does it leave the industry as far as this, a little break that we see with regards to tariff wars?
Yeah. So what this does is it's a temporary truce, basically, which is there. So the situation which was there before this was announced was you had a situation which was like having put embargoes on movement of goods with the very, very high tariffs which are there. So what this does is this puts this thing standstill to that type of a position. It gives time for both the countries to come together and negotiate. And as you said, they are the two largest economies which are there in the world. They contribute 43% of the global economy. And US runs the largest trade deficit as far as the goods are concerned. And China runs a huge surplus over there. So both the countries really need to be able to talk to come to an agreement. Now, while there's a temporary truce, basically, which is there, but the issues which were there on the table are still to be answered. They have not been resolved. So the US, when it put out the reciprocal tariffs, it was talking about tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers. It was also talking about the way the currency behaves and how the investment flows go as a result of the imbalances which are there. So those issues are still to be discussed and still to be finalized. Now, one of the things that is getting speculated is will this lead to a reconfiguration of some of the supply chains which are there around the world? So, and if any reconfiguration happens, then it is going to impact the companies and businesses from a longer term perspective. So what it does is it gives a pause which is there. Some of the shorter term pressures which are there, they go off, which were on account of high tariffs. But however, from a longer term and a strategic perspective which is there, we need to see what the final agreement is like. Because so far the US has only negotiated one agreement, which is with UK. And UK doesn't run a current account surplus. It runs a current account deficit, which is there. And depending upon what the outcome of this is and what does it mean as far as resetting of the rules for the global trade, whether you'll have much more of bilateralism, what will happen to multilateralism, what will happen to the currency values. So there are a lot of issues which will come on the table. So I think the businesses really need to watch from a longer term perspective to see how this thing plays out and thereafter make calls on a longer term basis going forward.
Absolutely. Businesses need to be, need to watch out for what's likely to happen in the near future. It's going to have a lot of impact, cascading impact and effect really on things to come. Ambassador, let me bring you back into the picture now. I was reading in the US media, this past week about how after all the rhetoric that the Trump administration has really ratcheted up about tariff wars and trade wars, etc., this seems to be like a major step back for the Trump administration. Would you see it from that perspective, or do you think that this is a win-win for all?
No, I think for those of us who have been observing Trump for some time, and remember, we had the luxury of having a previous Trump administration not very long ago. And while it did bring disruptions, we were anticipating them this time as well. But some of those patterns are predictable for this very unpredictable nature of administration that we have with us. So I think what we do know is that there is a certain ratcheting up of expectations to soften the adversary, so to say, and to gain certain negotiating advantage. And then, of course, the process of negotiations happens. Now, the negotiations will actually depend very much on the kind of relative weights that the two have. And therefore, this particular negotiation between the United States and China will be particularly significant because it carries enormous weight, quite unlike many of the others. I think there are two other issues that I want to bring in at this point. One from the purely economic perspective, the issue about the balance in the services sector has not been raised by the Make America Great Again campaign. It is focused purely on the goods, whereas in the services, the United States has a net surplus. Also related to this is the fact that it is not necessary that you need to have this balance with every country. But I think as the details of it work out, there would be some kind of cohesion in this overall balance that would be sought rather than the balance with each individual partner. And in this particular negotiation pattern, one of the things that will emerge is that the US, being the party that is actually going to be negotiating with so many partners, will actually be at a position of relative advantage. Because in other words, what it will have is the offer statements from a range of parties, and therefore it'll have a better advantage. But there is a second aspect, which is somewhat non-economic and which is related to security, because I think this entire question began because of the imbalance between the geo-economic shift on the one hand and the non-shift on the geostrategic. And I think on the geostrategic aspect, where a lot of the security services and expenses on that are now sought to be borne by other countries, particularly in the European Union, is an indication that there are going to be major shifts which are going to go beyond just this pure aspect of trade. So we have a lot of transformations coming about.
Absolutely. I think that's the key word there. A lot of transformations and constant change really with regards to what's likely to happen from a geopolitical as well as a geo-economic point of view. Niti, Bhasin, let me come back to you once again now. Let's also look at a few other things that have happened this past month. We've seen a slew of FTAs, trade deals being worked out, be it between India and the UK and the US and China, of course, that we've spoken about over the last 12 minutes or so. So is this going to be the new normal? Are we going to see trade deals being put on the fast track in the months to come?
Yes, we do see a lot of proliferation of free trade agreements in the recent past. This is actually attributable to a number of reasons. One is what we are witnessing is a slight weakening of the WTO multilateral, trading-based order. The dispute settlement mechanism is not functional. A lot of countries are not conforming to what the WTO rules talk about. The US, which was the torchbearer of a rules-based order itself, is now, imposing retaliatory tariffs. So because of all that we see in terms of the multilateral system, countries find it easier and quicker to execute bilateral agreements, like we have seen in the case of FTAs. This is basically on account of two reasons. One, as I said, is because it's easier and quicker and it doesn't require consensus the way we need it in the WTO. Secondly, whenever countries enter into bilateral agreements, they negotiate on the basis of their respective offensive and defensive interests. So when India enters into an agreement with EFTA countries, it is based on what India has to offer and what it can get from those countries, which may be very different from what EU has to offer or what UAE has to offer. So they are more tailor-made for countries, and therefore they offer more advantages in that sense. And yes, we have seen a lot of proliferation of these agreements in the recent past, which means that in times to come, we should be prepared for a lot of countries to devise their own mechanisms as far as trading is concerned, as far as dispute settlement is concerned, through these bilateral agreements. However, if we look at the broader or the larger picture, this era or this proliferation of bilaterals is not good from a global trade point of view. Because if every country or if every group of countries tries to sort of impose and levy tariffs and decide their terms of conditions on their own, international trade dynamics are going to be affected in that process. Because when a country trades, it doesn't just trade with one other country, it trades with a multiple number of countries. So having custom-made trade dynamics would not help in that case. So I guess, yeah, that's what I would like to say.
Absolutely. I think very succinctly put and pointed out really as to what kind of an impact and how all of this is going to pan out. Rajnish Gupta, coming back to you now, let's also try and understand what does all of this mean for India and what does it mean for Indian companies and entrepreneurs?
Yeah. So, when the reciprocal tariffs were first announced, then very quickly, what people did was they started comparing the 26% reciprocal tariff on India vis-a-vis those which were proposed for China and equally importantly for the ASEAN countries, which have a closer economic relationship with China. So, for example, Vietnam was put in the 40s, Thailand at 36%. So the general sense which was there as of that point of time was that this may throw open opportunities for India to get into the global supply chains and be able to replicate the success that India as an economy has had with Apple shifting some of its manufacturing over here in India. And you could get into supply chains in different ways, which was either by becoming contract suppliers or by having the principals who have a large market shares in the Western economies to come and invest over here. Now, what the government has been doing for some time and which has picked up pace over here is being the FTAs that India is negotiating. The FTA with the UK was announced recently. And in fact, the discussions on the India-US FTA began in February, much before the reciprocal tariffs were announced. And similarly, there's a discussion which is going on with the EU, which hopefully will pick up speed. And what all of this does is that it would provide market access, make a lot of the goods cheaper. But when you're getting into supply chains, it's really about building factories. It's about making investments. And unlike financial investments, which can move in and out very quickly, when you are building factories, you're looking at relative stability. You'd like to be there for 10 years, 15 years, really to be able to build something which will be long lasting. So I guess what will happen is, and one other thing which I want to point out is if you look at the the US-UK agreement which is there, then there's a carve out which has been given for UK to be able to export certain amount of cars at a tariff which is below 25%, which is there. So when India negotiates the FTA with US, it is possible that we also get similar carve-outs and all. We don't know what it would look like as of this point of time. So I think from an Indian business perspective, people are going to be looking at what type of opportunities which come up because of a shift which may happen in some of the supply chains, what opportunities that we get. And we really would need to wait a little while, which is there, depending upon what the contours of the Indian-US agreements are, what the India-EU agreements are, and how this whole space plays out. And equally important, what gets negotiated with other countries. Because as I said, the initial euphoria was, euphoria is a strong word, but initial optimism was to do with the fact that the reciprocal tariffs for India were lower vis-a-vis some of the other countries which would compete to be a part of the global supply chains.
Absolutely. All right. It's time to get closing comments now, concluding remarks on the best way forward. What next? I'll start with you, Ambassador. I'd like you to touch upon two aspects. One, what does this mean for multilaterals? And second, what does this mean for India?
Yeah, let me touch the first part about what does it mean for India. I think we see this as a great opportunity, and I'm responding particularly in the context of how we've dealt with the United States. We've essentially told the United States that, if you look at a project which is to make your economy great again, you've got to work together with us so that our economy can grow as well. And this manifests itself in the fact that we actually set out a very ambitious trade perspective for the two of us to cross $500 billion in trade, which is very, very ambitious. But what that means is that you can actually enlarge the cake in which both sides can actually benefit. And so it gets to be less of a zero-sum game in that first instance. It also expands the discussion beyond just the question of pure tariffs, because in the real world of trade, tariffs is just one component. Non-tariff barriers, as was also mentioned, is a big element. Also, the kind of business environment that you have, because I think the essential point about supply chains is, do you have a business environment that actually is encouraging? And India has been doing this successively over the last several years to make our business environment more congenial. And finally, of course, there is this question of productivity, because that's what really will drive investment decisions towards a certain place. So for us, I think this is a really good opportunity. And given the kind of momentum that we have given to the manufacturing process in particular, this is going to be a huge benefit. The other question about multilaterals is something that I think I'm a little less optimistic about. It's true, as my fellow panelists have said earlier, that the WTO has been in flux. It has really not been able to make up its decision because consensus is eluded, as the power brokers in the WTO are fighting a battle for protection of their particular interests, whereas rising emerging economies want greater space. And this particular question has not been resolved, even though there have been a number of new issues that have been brought into the multilateral process.
Right.
So I suspect we will see the multilateral process picking up momentum only after these bilateral deals and early harvest have brought some sort of certainty to the economic growth. And remember that a large part of the OECD is still in a low growth stage. So only once growth picks up will they have the confidence to get into the multilaterals in a much more positive way.
Right, absolutely. Niti, Bhasin, concluding remarks.
Yeah, so well, to conclude, I think what countries, or US in particular, should understand is that not every trade deficit is bad and not every trade surplus is good. Deficit is good as long as what we are doing means that we are buying something which is cheaper from another country and using our resources in something which is more productive. So, as the ambassador said, we don't have to just look at the tariffs. Tariffs sometimes could simply mean that you are just making goods more expensive for your citizens rather than damaging the other country. So that is one part of it. For India, yes, there are opportunities. There have been opportunities for a very long time. We have been racing up to those opportunities through various schemes like PLI and all of that. The idea is, although the China +1 strategy has been in place for a very long period of time, but we need to really speed up the competitiveness. Like, for instance, if the US China truce that has happened, we have lost a bit of advantage in the China plus one leveraging that we were looking forward to do. So I guess, yeah, for India, we need to brace up a little more. We need to match the scaling and the pricing which China has to offer. And more importantly, center-state coordination is what I think.
Sure, absolutely. And Rajnish Gupta, please close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, so this resetting basically, which is happening, and if one goes by some of the comments which have been made by the US administration, so they have basically promised that they would be deregulating, there would be cheaper energy which will be available, and there would be incentives which are there for the domestic manufacturing in the US, and it's really to get the manufacturing going. And as my fellow panelists have said, it's a deeper issue basically which is there. It also boils down to the area of non-tariff barriers. And also what we haven't really discussed much over here is also it boils down to currency values.
Right.
Because the US government has been talking about currency manipulation, which is there. So for example, if you have a 10% tariff and you have a 10% appreciation in the US dollar, then that will negate the impact of the tariff which is there. So how the currencies play out is going to have impact on how this plays out. And there would be more things which would need to be done, like capital controls and other things, if you want to be able to control that part of it. But coming back to India, given the deregulation and the whole talk on making the economies competitive, so as my fellow panelists have said, it's time for India also, and which is what our government is also doing, is to make our manufacturing more competitive.
Right.
It's really to get the ease of business to be easier, which is there in India, getting the cost of doing business lower, which
Points taken.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think these are very, very valid and important points, and these are the issues that need to be addressed sooner rather than later. And if we have to take use of this and make it an opportunity to flourish in the near future. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Much appreciate you spending time here on Sansad TV. Well, that's it from me. See you again next time.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.